I'm Susan Yawkey with VOA's Middle East Monitor. Coming up, response to new sanctions on Syria and Iran.
Probably one of the most significant things that will happen sometime in the near future is a change in Syria. Iran has really only two allies left.
Is an Islamist success a sign of Egypt's future or past? A Pakistani boycott jeopardizes a conference on Afghanistan. And the appeal for the release of a man reportedly trying to help Jews in Cuba. It's all ahead on VOA. New allegations of brutality in Syria's crackdown on anti-government protesters have spurred calls for Syria to be tried for crimes against humanity. UN Human Rights Chief Navi Pillay has accused the Syrian government of causing the deaths of hundreds of children. Pillay told a meeting of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva that Syria should be referred to the International Criminal Court. In response, Syria's ambassador to the UN, Faisal Kabaz Hamoui, said the international community has ignored Syria's efforts to reform. He is speaking through an interpreter on Al Jazeera.
They have also ignored things done by armed gangs. There has been focus only on one aspect of the situation. We have warned against this. This is premeditated negligence. It's like pouring oil on flames.
The UN estimates more than 4,000 people have died since anti-government protesters began demanding President Bashar al-Assad step down more than 8 months ago. Today's protests are calling for the international community to establish buffer zones to protect civilians. Syria says those civilians and its security forces are being attacked by armed terrorists and that its crackdown is a necessary response. The White House Thursday welcomed new steps by the European Union to tighten sanctions on Iran and Syria. VOA senior White House correspondent Dan Robinson reports.
The latest steps by the EU expand the list of members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps banned from doing business with EU countries or receiving visas to travel there. They stop short of any decision to halt oil purchases from Iran to further increase pressure over Tehran's nuclear program or its policies in the region, despite expectations that this week's mob attack on Britain's embassy in Iran would prompt stronger steps. The White House issued a statement Thursday welcoming the EU action, as well as new steps against 12 officials and 11 entities in Syria, where the United Nations says more than 4,000 people have died in government crackdowns on protesters. Here is Press Secretary Jay Carney.
We welcome today's announcement by the European Union of new economic sanctions and other measures against both Iran and Syria. The United States recently increased our own sanctions, as you know, on Iran, and today announced additional sanctions against Syrian officials and entities.
The wording of Thursday's statement was notable in that it reflects the Obama administration approach of more frequently coupling Iranian actions with the situation in Syria. It spoke of a commitment to work together on shared challenges and coordination to increase pressure on Iran and Syria to ensure that their flagrant violations of international norms come to an end. The U.S. has said President Bashar al-Assad has lost legitimacy and should end all government-sanctioned violence against demonstrators and help pave the way for a democratic transition for the Syrian people. Carney was asked by one reporter if a key objective of Vice President Joe Biden's visit to Turkey was to ask for more help from the government in Ankara on Iran. The president's spokesman had no immediate response on that, but repeated a largely unchanged U.S. statement about Washington's overall positive assessment of international cooperation aimed at pressuring Tehran.
Broadly on Iran, we have been very focused on and pleased by the international consensus that has been developed over these several years to sanction Iran, to pressure and isolate Iran, and that continues today.
During a U.S. Senate hearing on Thursday, the Obama administration came under additional pressure from U.S. lawmakers who believe the United States needs to take stronger steps against Iran. Treasury and State Department officials told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee the administration is committed to putting sustained pressure on Iran, but multilateral measures need to be a priority now. David Cohen, Treasury Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, said a bipartisan amendment to ban U.S. companies from doing business with any foreign financial institution connected with Iran's central bank could harm international coordination aimed at stepping up pressure on Tehran. Dan Robinson, VOA News, the White House.
A top State Department official said Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's departure is inevitable. At a Senate committee hearing on Iran sanctions, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Wendy Sherman said the downfall of the Syrian leader, a critical ally of Tehran, is just a matter of time.
The international environment is changing on a daily basis, and probably one of the most significant things that will happen sometime in the near future is a change in Syria. Iran has really only two allies left, Syria and Hezbollah. And when indeed Bashar al-Assad steps aside, which he most undoubtedly will do, it's just a matter of when, not if, Iran will lose one of its last proxies in the world.
At the State Department, Deputy Spokesman Mark Toner said the United States is reluctant to describe the situation in Syria as civil warfare, since the overwhelming share of the violence has come from pro-regime forces. He said Assad government tactics are taking Syria down a very dangerous path, but that the United States counsels nonviolence by its opponents.
We have been very clear in saying that we believe that the opposition needs to remain peaceful. We've also been clear in saying that it's been Assad's reaction to these peaceful protests that has led us to, on the part of some, the Free Syrian Army, this violent reaction to ongoing onslaughts from the Syrian regime.
Toner said the Obama administration still intends to send U.S. Ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, back to his post in the near future, when his safety can be assured. The outspoken U.S. envoy, withdrawn in October, drew the wrath of the Damascus government for his outreach to opposition figures. Toner said it is important for the United States to have a credible, senior-level observer on the ground in Syria to bear witness to what is happening there. As we've been reporting, the European Union foreign ministers agreed to broaden sanctions against Iran Thursday, but they also condemned that mob attack on Britain's embassy in Tehran. At a news conference, European Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton read out a statement on the assault by Iranian protesters Tuesday.
The Council is outraged by the attack on the British Embassy in Tehran and utterly condemns it. It also deplores the decision to expel the British ambassador from Tehran. The Council considers these actions against the UK as actions against the European Union as a whole.
Ashton said EU members are considering further sanctions against Tehran, but exactly what form they will take remains unclear. European officials stress that the sanctions are not in retaliation for the embassy attack, but rather responds to a recent report by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which warned of a possible military dimension to Iran's nuclear program. Iran says its program is for peaceful purposes only. Again, European Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton.
This is part of our ongoing concern as a result of the report from the IAEA we discussed last time, and the desire for us to see Iran take seriously the international community's call for it to respect its obligations and move away from the pursuit of nuclear weapon technology.
France, Germany, and the Netherlands have withdrawn their envoys from Tehran. Norway said it was closing its embassy as a precaution. Senior correspondent Gary Thomas in Washington and correspondent Margaret Bashir, covering the United Nations in New York, joined VOA's Sarah Williams on Reporter's Notebook to talk about Syrian-Iranian relationship.
British Foreign Secretary Haig said this week the violence in Syria and Iran is linked. What is your perspective on that?
I think that there is some linkage, but I don't think it's perhaps as great as Secretary Haig might imply. Syria has its own problems. The uprising that's going on there is not linked, I think, to what's going on with Iran. I think Iran may be trying to fuel some of it, but I just think that Syria has just so much of its own internal problems that it's got to deal with. I just don't think the linkage is as strong as perhaps might be indicated.
And if you remember, a few weeks ago or a few months ago, I think in August perhaps, Iran was kind of saying, Syria, whoa, slow down a bit, listen to your people. They were actually kind of saying, listen to the protesters at one point.
Yeah,
so
they were trying to say,
I think they're very concerned. They don't want us going down the
in
tube.
Egypt too. They were saying, listen to your people. Well, of course, they suppressed their own green movement, their own internal revolution that calls for freedom and for democracy, and were rather brutally suppressed.
Well, sure, but they're only telling them, listen to your people, because they don't want the Assad regime to go. Because the opposition may not be so friendly to them. And in fact, today there's a story in the Wall Street Journal that the main opposition group in Syria says they've cut ties to Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas if they come to power, which is the worst-case scenario for Tehran because they're so isolated. They need Syria. So they may be telling them, give lip service to the international community because we need you, buddy.
Yeah, just one other point, bringing Egypt into this for just a second. We now have the elections that are going on in Egypt, but that's an unfinished revolution. Revolutions are not static. They continue. They're an organic process, and I think there's still a lot of concern about what's going to go on with Egypt, what's going to go on with the Islamic parties, what kind of a rule they would like to impose, and there's concern that the military has not given up power and that there may be a backsliding, and we've seen some of it already, back into events that happened earlier. So I still think there's a lot of concern with what's going on with Egypt.
Senior correspondent Gary Thomas and UN correspondent Margaret Bashir speaking with VOA's Sarah Williams. To hear more of the remarks, tune in this weekend for Reporter's Notebook on radio or listen online at voanews.com. Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood is thought to be taking the early lead in the nation's months-long parliamentary elections, but support for the moderate Islamist group, as well as for more fundamentalist ones, may say more about Egypt's past than future. VOA's Elizabeth Aird has the story from Cairo.
From a purely practical standpoint, the Muslim Brotherhood was expected to benefit from the timetable of elections. The best organized, yet officially banned opposition group under the old government, the Brotherhood has left its newly formed competitors scrambling to catch up. Perhaps more important is the suffering members of the Brotherhood endured: arbitrary arrest, imprisonment, and torture. Human Rights Watch Egypt researcher Heba Morayev says both privately and in recent years more publicly, members were at the forefront in opposing the former government's tactics.
They took on many human rights issues, in a sense, and would very often use their position of being the victim of these violations, I think, to recruit other sympathizers who were angry at Mubarak's repressive regime.
Morayev also points to the Brotherhood's criticism of rampant corruption in the Mubarak years and the long history of the group's charitable works, key economic points in a nation where at least one-third live in poverty. Such acts, she says, have given the Brotherhood a very strong grassroots presence. The group's slogan, "Islam is the answer," also strikes a resonant chord in deeply devout Egypt, but political observers note the Brotherhood has a moderate face that also appeals to the pragmatic nature of many here. It stands in contrast to another Islamist group expected to make its presence felt in these first post-Mubarak elections, the fundamentalist Salafis. Human Rights Watch researcher Morayev.
For the Salafis, their situation was a lot worse from the Brotherhood because they were not able to operate at all as a group politically. And this is the first year in 2011 that we've actually seen Salafis organizing themselves into different parties, being much more present in the media. Because Salafis were very, very underground and they would only conduct charitable activities.
But for all the apparent newfound success of both groups, political analyst and publisher Hisham Qasim says neither has much of a track record as political strategists, and calls into question how well they might do in the future.
The Brotherhood is, I could talk for hours on, how they've bungled historically and how I think they will bungle again. But to get to the main points, they have a problem that most of the political forces don't trust them.
The Brotherhood, he says, promises too much to potential allies, but then goes back on its word when it gets the upper hand. The Salafis, he says, have another problem. While the puritanical group might attract some by using the language of democracy, Qasim argues its true message will prove offensive to the majority of Egyptians.
They adapt, and then a situation arises and you begin to hear words of, we are ready to become martyrs, and relapsing into their old diction. In addition to their aggressive attitude, where they push people around in the street, claiming that they are the voice of God or the hand of God on earth. They are anarchic, they don't have a central command. Their figures are estimated to be 1.5 million in an 80 million nation.
Human rights researcher Marayev says the real test will come as the new government is formed and both groups will face the responsibilities of running a country.
We'll see how the Brotherhood does in this first term of Parliament, how they manage to deal with a lot of the bigger policy issues which they've never had to address because all they've ever had to do was to criticize the repressive tactics of a Mubarak government. And now we're going to shift into a new phase.
Only then, she says, will it be clear if people are putting blind faith in the religious nature of the Brotherhood and the Salafis, or whether their support was based on the pragmatic hope these groups would bring about real change. Elizabeth Arrett, VOA News, Cairo.
Are you looking for a comprehensive daily look at events reshaping the Middle East? Visit voanews.com/ME. You'll find VOA's original reporting from the region, in-depth analysis from our Washington team, VIP interviews, online polls, photo essays, and mini documentaries. Bookmark us or add us to your RSS reader. That's voanews.com/ME.
The base that once served as headquarters for the U.S. military in Iraq is now under Iraqi control. A United States military spokesman said U.S. officials handed over Camp Victory to Iraq today after officials from both countries signed the necessary paperwork. There was no formal handover ceremony. About 13,000 U.S. troops remain in Iraq but are scheduled to leave by the end of the month. The pullout will end a military presence that began with the 2003 U.S.-led invasion that toppled former dictator Saddam Hussein. Camp Victory, a sprawling U.S. military compound on the outskirts of Baghdad, had served as the U.S. military headquarters in Iraq since 2003. Top U.S. military officials lived at the site, which is encircled by 42 kilometers of protective walls. At its height, the base was home to more than 40,000 troops and military-related personnel. Pakistan's decision to boycott an international conference on Afghanistan's future is jeopardizing the meeting's success. The conference is scheduled to begin Monday in Bonn, Germany. VOA correspondent Meredith Buell has details.
Anger in Pakistan continues to grow over the deaths of 24 Pakistani soldiers in recent NATO airstrikes along the border with Afghanistan. Pakistan has blocked critical NATO supply routes into Afghanistan and ordered U.S. personnel to evacuate an air base believed to be used for launching drones that fire missiles on militant targets. Andrew Wilder is an expert on South Asia at the U.S. Institute of Peace.
If there's going to be a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Afghanistan, Pakistan is going to have to play a constructive role in that process.
The Pakistani soldiers' deaths have dealt a blow to U.S.-Pakistan relations. Islamabad has dismissed international calls to reconsider its boycott of the Bonn conference. Coalition forces in Afghanistan are scheduled to withdraw in the next few years, and a goal of the talks is to develop strategies for a smooth transition. State Department spokesman Mark Toner.
We believe it's very much in Pakistan's interest to attend the Bonn conference because the focus of that is all about trying to build a more stable and peaceful Afghanistan.
10 years ago, diplomats attended a conference in Bonn and appointed a transitional government in Afghanistan following the U.S.-led invasion in response to the September 11 terrorist attacks. This time, the transfer of security responsibility to Afghan forces is on the agenda. The complete turnover will depend on a number of factors, says Ali Jalali, a professor at the National Defense University in Washington.
One is the building of its capacity until 2014. The other was a progress toward reconciliation with the opposition forces that are fighting against the Afghan government. And third is the cooperation from the regional countries, particularly Pakistan.
Political reconciliation between the Taliban and the Afghan government is another issue to be discussed in Bonn. Lakhdar Brahimi is a former UN Special Envoy in Afghanistan.
Everybody is talking about how you meet the Taliban and talk to them now, and it's extremely difficult. In 2002, it would have been very easy. We failed to do that. That's a very, very big failure.
Brahimi says in the years after the Taliban were driven from power, there were not enough international troops to secure the country, allowing the insurgent group to rebuild. He calls that a major mistake of the first Bonn conference and says the international community is to blame.
We helped the Afghans put this program together. We stopped helping them properly implementing it. by not paying attention to the most important aspect of the process, which is security.
The role of international military forces is also on the agenda in Bonn, along with foreign aid after the 2014 deadline for combat soldiers to leave Afghanistan. Meredith Buell, VOA News, Washington.
If you crave the latest news and analysis about the Middle East, follow us on Twitter. You can find it by searching @VOA Middle East. Every day we tweet VOA's own special reports, analysis, VIP interviews, photo essays, and mini documentaries. Plus, you can get the latest buzz from VOA's Mideast team and correspondents. VOA Middle East on Twitter. Get a read on the news before it happens. Two years ago this week, American contractor Alan Gross was arrested in Cuba on charges of bringing communications equipment into the country illegally. Judy Gross, his wife, says the U.S. government can be doing more to gain her husband's release, and she wants the United States and Cuba to work something out. VOA's Candace Williams in Washington has more on the story of a man reportedly trying to help Jews on the island.
Since his arrest in December 2009, Alan Gross has been tried in a Cuban court, convicted of crimes against the communist state, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. In August, an appeal to Cuba's Supreme Court was denied, and U.S. officials such as former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson have been unable to secure his release. Gross had been working for a private firm that says he was taking part in a U.S. government-financed program to strengthen civil society in Cuba. The Havana government says he illegally distributed satellite equipment to dissident groups and that he is a spy, a charge the United States denies. The company says he was working for the U.S. Agency for International Development's Cuba Democracy Program, bringing Internet access to Cuba's Jewish community. Gross's wife, Judy, says all he wanted to do was help the island's 3 main Jewish communities.
What's weird is that he came in with cell phones and laptops, and everything was checked by the Cuban customs. He has a receipt for the equipment. So then to say that he was arrested for bringing in this equipment is ludicrous.
Gross's family is seeking his release on humanitarian grounds, saying that his health has suffered and that his mother and daughter are suffering from cancer. Judy Gross recently visited her husband at a Cuban prison. She says he has lost weight, suffers from arthritis and gout, and that he is depressed and angry.
I found him the worst I'd seen him. You have to know Alan. He's this jovial, joking, gregarious kind of person that everybody gravitates to. I couldn't get him to smile.
Judy Gross says she wants President Barack Obama to intervene personally in her husband's case.
I don't know that much about the diplomacy. I don't see what would stop him from picking up the phone and at least trying to talk to President Castro. He might not get anywhere, but it would really be a good effort.
U.S. State Department spokesman Mark Toner says the United States raises Alan Gross's case with Cuba's government at every opportunity.
He's been held far too long, and we call for his immediate release on humanitarian grounds, and we continue to make that point to Cuban authorities.
Alan Gross's case has further strained relations between the United States and Cuba, which do not maintain formal diplomatic ties. A decades-old U.S. embargo on Cuba remains in effect, and President Obama says it will stay in place until Havana takes steps toward democratic reforms. Candace Williams, VOA News, Washington.
This show wraps up another week of VOA's Middle East Monitor. Our reporters, Cecily Hillary, Mohammed El-Shanawi, David Arnold, and David Bird. Our social media team, Yuri Hiltaichuk, Momo Hutton, and Jessica Stahl. Our director, Patrice Martin. Our managing editor, David Hutchins. Senior editor, Bob Morris. And all of our technicians and engineers here and around the world that make the show possible. I'm Susan Yawkey. Thanks for tuning in to Middle East Monitor.
For more on the stories you've heard on our radio programs, visit our website at voanews.com. That's where you'll find in-depth reports, related stories, videos, and more from our team of correspondents. Or take the news with you by downloading podcasts of your favorite VOA programs. That's at voanews.com. Online news for a changing world.